Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I know that everyone is busy, so thank you for taking the time to be here with me today. So, the workshop today is about positive parenting. So, we're going to look at some of the practices within positive parenting, what it is, how we can deal with behavior, and what we can do in terms of positive discipline. So, the different types of parenting styles and how we can approach difficult behavior. So, this workshop is for you if you're finding that your child is displaying behavior which you're unsure how to deal with, you're struggling, you might find yourself yelling, and we just want to look at ways to move forward. So before we get started, I just wanted to kind of remind you that today we really need to be kind to ourselves. When we look at positive parenting, as we know, no one is a perfect parent. We don't have a handbook when we become parents to learn all the perfect ways because no one is perfect and we're human. So it's okay if, as we're talking and as we're talking about the parenting styles, you find that maybe there's things that you may have done or said which maybe we don't agree with now, and that's okay. We want to find ways to move forward, and that's why we're here today to look at how we can move forward and what can we take away from this. As you know from my previous workshops, I always try to give you practical things, practical actions that you can take home and build and work on and try. So, what is positive parenting? So, positive parenting stems from the work of the Austrian psychologist Alfred Adler in the 1900s. His work was around children's need to have a sense of belonging. So, he believed that children need to feel connected to those around them, so within their family, whoever that may be, carers, the people, the guardians who live with them. And without that sense of belonging, without that sense of being part of something, then it would be hard for children to develop, to learn, and to grow. So, the bottom line of positive parenting is always remembering that before we try to put in discipline or correction or anything else, that the child needs to feel safe. They need to feel connected to everyone within the household or within the family. So, positive parenting looks at the different methods for us to be compassionate and firm at the same time. So, it doesn't just mean that because we have the word positive that we're always going to be positive, but it means that we try to find a balance and we'll look at how we can do that. Positive parenting involves communication, having boundaries, and positive discipline. So, how does it help? It helps because research has shown us that it helps to strengthen the family. It helps to build the trust amongst members of the family because it puts emphasis on the positive interactions that we have before we look at discipline or consequences. And it helps to create an environment at home in which members of the family are working cooperatively and constructively. So before we look at the practices within positive parenting, let's look at as a reminder some of the needs that children have as they're growing and what types of behavior we see and how we deal with them. So with babies, for example, we know that they behave in order to get their needs met immediately. So for example, if they're crying, that's telling us that there's some kind of immediate need, whether they're hungry or they need changing or there's something that's upsetting them. With older babies, for example, think behaviors like when they're spitting food or wiggling away from changing their nappy, we know that that's their way of expressing a like or dislike for something. With toddlers, they're called a ball of emotions because they're still developing it and their brain is still developing it. So that means that they're not always in control of their emotions, which is why we tend to see behaviors like frequent tantrums and explosive reactions. We see that they start to test our limits, test their limits, and push boundaries with school age children. So, this is our primary years. As they're learning and exploring the world around them all the time, they might have lots of questions as they're building on their views on different issues. They learn from what they see around them, so from us within the family and from school, but they also then start to make their own ideas and have their own views. So they're comparing all the time. They're starting to grow in independence and to push again on those boundaries. We might see that behavior becomes slightly more challenging as well. So with teens here, they're really developing their own identity. They are discovering what they want to do in the future, who they are, what is their place within the family, within their community, within their friends. So they also start to explore that a bit more. They might become more challenging, and the relationship with parents might start to change as they're becoming young adults. In the teen years, we notice that they might not be as open or not as talkative to parents. They might be more inclined to disagree with you, and friends tend to become a bigger influence on them or their behavior. So, some of the parenting styles. Hopefully, this is not too much to look at, but I'll just talk you through what research tells us about the different parenting styles that we may have and display. So, on the vertical axis, you'll see it says firm, so that's low to high. And then on the horizontal one, we've got fair, low to high. So, for example, let's start with authoritarian type of parenting. So, the authoritarian type of parenting is quite high on being firm, but low on being fair. So, we also call this punitive type of parenting. And this is when there is a difficult behavior, the consequence is done to the child. So here, usually there'll be things like blame or shame, which could be emotional or could be physical as well. Then we have uninvolved. Uninvolved tends to be quite low on being firm and low on being fair. So here we might tend to be a bit more absent when there are behaviors. And so it says not because we might not be dealing with the behavior. Then we have permissive. Permissive is quite low on being firm, but high on being fair. And here with permissive, as the word tells us, we might be we're trying to be very fair, but not firm at the same time. And so here we might also tend to be doing things for our children. So that means that we might not be giving them the age appropriate independence which they might need, and we're doing things for them all the time. And then the last parenting style is authoritative. So this is the restorative part of parenting style. It's the one that we're going to focus on today, and it's the one that we want to look at the different practices for us to be able to be in this area. So authoritative or restorative looks at being fair. So it's high on being fair, but also high on being firm. So we have both kind and firm at the same time. We can show compassion, we can have connection with children and young people, but we can also be firm when we need to be firm. So here, when we see difficult behavior, when we have challenging behavior, we're working with our children. So let's look at some of the practices now. So going into a bit of the details and all of the practical ways for you to build into a more restorative approach when we're looking at positive parenting. So connection before correction. So in Adlerian psychology, going back to where all of this stems from, like we said, if we're looking at the child's need to feel that they belong somewhere, then we look at how we can have that connection before we are dealing with the correction or the consequences or discipline. So, as part of connection, we have communication. So, I talk about communication if you've been to my other workshops all the time, because it's really the basis of a relationship. Is that communication, how we speak to each other, the language that we're using when we're talking to each other. So even within the family, with the different members of the family, if you have a partner, with your partner, or with children, in front of children. So the first bit of communication is active listening. So here, active listening, what we mean is if someone else is talking to us, if our child is talking to us, we try to give them. So, this, of course, doesn't always work. I understand everyone is busy or if you're doing other things, but ideally, we want to give them our undivided attention. So, that means that we're there and we're actively listening to them. We're giving them the time to explain what they mean, and we are showing them, I have time for you. If this doesn't always happen, or if children and young people notice that it's quite hard for them to have our attention and for us to listen to them, we might see that they start to compete for our attention. A good example of this is with technology. So, for example, if we tend to always be on our technology, on our phones and our laptops, even if we might not necessarily be working, young people and children might start to compete. And with younger children, you see it through behaviors like breaking things or doing something maybe a bit silly or that maybe they don't usually do. They're competing for our attention or doing something to gain our attention immediately. We might see shouting or screaming or doing something which they know might not be a very good choice just to gain our attention. And in that way, what happens over time is that they learn that that works for them, that doing those behaviors will work to get our immediate attention. Then we have criticism and sarcasm. So here we have to be a bit aware of how much criticism and the sarcasm that we use. Remember that the younger the child, the more difficult it will be for them, one, to understand sarcasm and what sarcasm is, but also how we explain and how we approach criticism, the language that we use when we are criticizing, how we're doing that. And open communication. So the basis of all of this is to try to have that open communication within family. Then we move on to validating feelings. If we're looking at a challenging behavior and something has happened, the first thing we want to do is to validate their feelings, that we understand that they're going through something difficult. We can see that they're going through something difficult. So this takes also a lot of energy for us to be calm and to always show that calm when we see frustration on the other side. Because if we don't, and the other person is very frustrated or maybe shouting or yelling, and we also start doing the same, inevitably that will turn into an argument. And it will be really hard to then de escalate from that. So we want to be able to, on the other side, we want to try as best as we can to show that calm. And if we can't, if we're not able to do that right now because something is maybe quite triggering for us, or it's just quite hard, we're frustrated, then that means that we can say something like, is it okay if we talk about this in 10 minutes? It's better to delay it and find another time to talk about it rather than having an explosive reaction ourselves in the moment and as the situation escalating. Validating feelings means also paying attention to their needs, talking through issues, and always showing that unconditional love, even if they've made mistakes, even if they've made choices which we know, that we could say, "I told you so," or that we knew, or we could see that coming. We accept that and we still show them unconditional love. So this goes back to then being kind and firm. So we want to still have boundaries. A restorative approach to positive parenting, or trying to be authoritative, like we said, being firm and yet kind, doesn't necessarily mean that there's no boundaries. We don't want to necessarily go into the permissive box, if you can remember from the graph earlier. But we can still have clear boundaries. We can still have clear expectations, and we can still have discipline. But I'll give you a tool in a moment in how you can install discipline in a positive way that doesn't cause harm or blame, shame, or pain on children. And then we've got family time. So, in order to build connection, we know that family time needs to be part of that routine. That doesn't mean that if we're working and we're busy, it needs to take hours, or it needs to be done for extensive hours every day. What it means is that we're still finding time at some point during the day, 5 or 10 minutes, beginning of the day or at the end of the day, to have a quick check in. How was your day? What happened? Is there anything you want to talk about? Is there anything that we ask open questions that maybe they want to speak to us about? If they don't, that's okay. We try again the next day, and so on. Planning time together. When, as a family, or within members of the family, do we have time that is planned to spend together? When we have challenging behavior and things are happening at home that are quite difficult, transitions, as we get closer to the end of the year for families who will be leaving Iceburn or going to different countries, we also want to think of how we approach those transitions, how we approach those challenges. Sometimes that needs to be a bit more formal, like a family meeting. We plan a time in which we're all going to maybe play a game initially all together in a circle. And then after the game, maybe we want to have a conversation about something that is challenging, something that is coming up. Another practice within positive parenting is encouragement versus praise. So we want to look at encouragement rather than just praise. That means, here's some of the elements. One, resilience. So we know that children learn behaviors from the world around them. That means from us, from teachers, from other children. Now, does it mean that it's all on you to be the perfect role model? No. Again, like I said, we are human. We all make mistakes. We don't behave or do things like we would like to, as like a parent handbook says. But we can try to show that that's okay as well. We also make mistakes. We're not perfect. And being a role model doesn't mean that you're always a perfect parent. It means that we are aware of when we aren't, of when maybe we yelled and we didn't mean to yell. It's not all on you, also because there's others around. There's teachers. Our teachers are also role models. They're learning from their teachers, from other professionals, and so it's okay for the others to be involved. It's not just up to you to then do all that. Of course, the home is the environment in which they're nurtured and they grow, but at the same time, they're learning from all the role models around them. So, role models are family, but also school. And if they're doing activities or they're involved in other areas or have other hobbies. And so it's all of us adults around them that are creating the role models and supportive network around them. But as part of that, we share coping strategies with them. As a role model, we either show them by living it. And so that means that if we are encouraging them to sleep early, or if we're encouraging them to not always be on their phone, that means that then we're aware of our behavior and how much we might do that. We want to share with them ways in which we cope if we're struggling. What are some of the things that you do that are helpful and are healthy when you're struggling, when you're stressed? What can they learn from that? And then we work on reinforcing their strengths, what they're good at. The encouragement looks at, even when things don't go well, what have they learned from that experience? So those curiosity questions, when we encourage them to think of what went well, what didn't, how they felt about a situation. So not focusing on the why questions. For example, if they come back home and they have maybe failed the test, so they didn't get what they quite wanted, they didn't feel like it went well. We have some who are sitting exams at the moment. We don't want to focus too much on the why questions. And that's because usually why questions to the other person seem to sometimes be kind of like an interrogation. We tend to be quite defensive when we receive why questions. And so it's always good to focus on the what or the how questions. Encouragement looks at how we can praise the effort. And this might seem quite obvious, but at the same time, we've seen from research that those who have grown up with receiving encouragement for how they've worked tend as adults to choose challenging tasks. Those who are used to receiving praise for the outcome. So, for example, here I've put, you've got a 7, I'm so proud of you. And yes, we are proud that they've done well, but we're proud because we know that they've worked hard for it. So, we want to praise them for the work that they've been doing, for the process along the way, not just for the outcome, because then that tells us that in the future, they will tend to go for tasks that are not quick and easy, not for the shortcut, but they will go for things that are challenging as well. And then learning to let go. So, encouragement also means going back to the table of the parenting styles, not always being too permissive, learning when it's okay to step back and to let them um, find a way to cope through something, let them work through a strategy, even if we see again that maybe might be a mistake, and then we can support them through it. But we're not there constantly nagging, constantly lecturing or threatening. These are the situations in which we see the power struggles, and which we see that then there's resistance and rebellion when we're not able to let go and give age appropriate independence. It doesn't mean that we have to be absent, but we have to find a balance for letting them know that sometimes it's okay for me to step back. And so when we're looking at then the problem solving, when we have problems and things don't go too well, we are working through problems together. So with the restorative and the table where it says with them, we're working with them, not for them, and not to them. Then we've got routines. So routines is a really important part of positive parenting. And we have routines, for example, in school. And you'll notice how with our younger students in PYP, when there aren't the same routines as always, that becomes quite difficult. That could be, for example, that a teacher's not present on that particular day, or something's a bit different, they can't go to the same room. We see that they struggle with that. And that's because as humans, we like routine, we like structure. We know how difficult it is when we have uncertainty. And depending on how children deal with change, depending on how we deal with uncertainty or stress, we'll see different behaviors. So routines create structure. So that doesn't mean that you have to plan from 9 to when they go to bed everything that you're doing, but it just means that we have some kind of a routine. Usually meal times are a good routine to have. So for example, planning to have dinners together, or on the weekends preparing having lunch together, or but planning times in which you will be together, in which we can have some kind of a routine, or planning maybe on the weekends we go for a walk together, and that becomes part of our weekly routine, so they know what to expect from us. We become more predictable. Students, children, young people, they like predictability. They like to know what will come next. And that's because as humans, we all like to have a sense of control. That doesn't mean that we become too controlling, again, as parents learning to step back, but it means that we like to know what's next, what's coming. And so that gives us organization and will be helpful when there's uncertainty. If we can have a good routine at home of how, for example, when we come to school, how that's done, when we come back home, what happens when they come back home, before we go to bed, what's our bedtime routine, even for older students. Every day, do we have a check in before we go to bed, or do we just ask them something, or do we do something together? For younger children, do we read to them before when they go to bed, or do we decide to have breakfast together before they come to school, so they know what's going to happen next? So routine charts are tools which we can use depending on the age to create that routine. So, for example, for our younger children, we might want to have an actual chart, even with photographs, maybe, so of things that they're going to do during the day. With young people, so our NYP or DP students, maybe we want to encourage them to have journals, maybe to have short lists of what to do, or maybe to work on calendars. With to-do lists, I say short lists because we don't want them to be in the habit of creating these long lists, which we know, if we have long lists of things to do, we tend to then procrastinate because it can seem like it's too much and I'm never going to get it done. And so if we see that they're creating lists or they're trying to create calendars, we want to make sure, or if we can, guide them into having short lists, just lists for that day. What do you want to achieve today? What's your goal today? Small tasks. And the small tasks is what will help to reach our overall goal. Change takes time. And if we have challenging behavior at home and we're trying to put in all these different practices of positive parenting, it takes time. If we are trying to show more communication or show how we cope with things, be role models, or look at any of the strategies that I've talked about, it takes time and consistency. We have to be consistent in what we're trying to do. So if you decide that you're going to start a family routine or a check-in, we need to then be consistent with that. So that means starting small so that we can build on consistency and then move to the next step so that we can have realistic goals. Another practice within positive parenting is guidance. So we want to focus on guidance rather than control. What does that mean? We don't want to necessarily take all the power away from them and do things for them or to them. We want to guide them through it. It's like we're side to side, like when we're walking, which is why in the past I know that parents have said that they find it useful to talk in the car, for example, or as you're walking together, because of being next to each other doesn't feel like I'm standing in front of you and telling you what to do. So with guidance, it's finding balance. How can we find balance within the environment at home? How can we be supportive rather than controlling? How can we give them independence and boundaries without taking over? So with boundaries, a useful one to think about is technology. What do we do with technology at home? How do we find boundaries? Are we finding a common agreement? Are we simply trying to control things for them? Do we give them privacy? Do we knock before we walk into their rooms? Do we let them know that we're coming in? Or do we want to be in control of things that they're doing, of their behaviors? So routines rather than control, guidance rather than being too controlling. So within positive discipline, uh, here's one of the cycles or vicious cycles which we can sometimes find ourselves in. So with positive parenting, like I said, there's still an element of discipline. It doesn't mean that we're permissive and they can do anything and we're always okay with it. We can always support through them and always show unconditional love, but we can still have boundaries within the family. So firm but fair. So here is a short graph, I guess, or just image of something that we see that can happen. So when we have challenging behavior, we usually then ask, to not for them to not display that behavior or to do something different about the behavior. Then we repeat, please do not do this. We remind, I said we should be doing this, or I said we should be doing that. Again, we ask, repeat, remind until either us or them or both explode. Um, and this is a way which a lot of parents we find ourselves being in, where we ask, repeat, and remind, and then it all ends up in an argument. So let's look at how, or a tool, a helpful tool, in which we can still have positive discipline without simply asking, repeating, and reminding, and then going to an explosive reaction in which we're maybe shouting to each other, there's yelling, and we've not actually reached, or they've not learned from the behavior. Even if we know that maybe something hasn't gone well, it's not been helpful for both of us. So, with positive discipline, we want to think first of what are our battles. So, I'm going to give you just a moment to think about what are the three behaviors that you notice within your children and young people that they're struggling with at home, that you're struggling with at home. Is it technology? Is it when struggling before going to bed? Is it struggling to leave the house in the morning? Is it unstructured time? What are the times in which you find yourself maybe shouting? What are the times in which you find yourself being in those constant arguments? Okay, so just give you a moment to think about for you what those top three are. Then we want to think of what might be the cause of these battles, of these behaviors that we see. So we know that behavior is not random. Like I said, for example, with the example of being on our phone a lot and then the child doing something to get our attention immediately. So in that case, for example, that behavior was not random. The choice they made to break something or to do something to get our attention straight away was not random. And that tends to be the same for different types of behavior. That behavior is not random. It's there for a reason. It's happening for a reason. Whether they're doing it consciously or not, it's happening. And when it happens and it works for them, so for example, if it works, they do something and that works to get our attention. So with the phones, if let's say that the child breaks something and they have our attention straight away because we've noticed something has happened, then they will learn that that's a way for them to gain our attention. And so if that works, they will continue to use that because it works for them. And with behavior, there's also, I'll talk about these two elements: their need for attention, so that positive connection, and some need for positive power of feeling and control. And we all have these two, and I'll explain them in a bit more depth in a moment. And then, as part of positive discipline, there's punishment versus discipline. So, punishment involves some level of blame, shame, or pain, which could be emotional or physical. We are overpowering them with fear and they eventually shut down. If something happens, we have a challenging behavior, we're not sure why they're behaving in that certain way, and we're using one of these. At some point, we've all used them, unfortunately, because, like I said, we're not perfect. And so we have had those arguments, those outbursts. What we are doing, I'll use the example of shouting or having an argument and that escalating, is that there's an element of shaming them or an element of causing pain. And so then they will immediately shut down. The why questions: why have you done this? Why did this just happen? Why did you choose to do this? So that why causes us to have a threatening tone straight away. And as humans, whenever we see that threat, we become defensive and we shut down. So if we're trying to tell them or give them a message about why that behavior was wrong, they're not learning from us, they're not even listening to us. And so that is not the time or the way for us to install some kind of discipline, because they will simply shut down, not listen to anything we've said. And you might have noticed this. And then we see that behavior being repeated again. Positive discipline, on the other hand, looks at how we can have boundaries, we can have consequences, but with respect. We're not shaming them, we're not blaming them, we're not using the why questions, we're not threatening, but we're still giving respect. We're still trying to show the calm. Again, if we can't show the calm, that means that we need to do this at another time. We'll have this conversation at another time, but there's consequence with respect. And so when we're looking at meeting their needs, like I said, we all have two buckets. We have a bucket that needs attention and a bucket that needs power. The bucket that needs attention, going back to the connection before correction, needs some kind of positive attention. And you might think, well, what if I give them a lot of attention and I still see difficult behaviors? Then we have to think about, what about the other bucket? How much power, or how much do they feel in control of a situation? Feeling in control doesn't mean that they are the parents in the household. Feeling in control means that they feel like they have choice in something that happens, or that there's still an element of control within that. For example, if you are moving at the end of the year, let's say, you're moving, and so you're giving them lots of attention. You're talking about the move. You've told them all about the next place, the next house, and at school where you're going. But do they feel quite helpless in that? We know that we can't give them power because they can't choose that they're moving. But what can we give them? How can we help them feel in control of that situation? That means we can say, well, what would you like to do before the move? Or is there anything about this in which you would like to change? And try to see where the gaps are, where we can help them to feel like they still have a sense of control. On the other hand, if we're all giving them a lot of power, they have a lot of control, they have a lot of choice, they can do whatever they want, come back home at whatever time they want, then we have to think about, we are trying to give them a lot of control that is age appropriate, but how much attention are we giving to them? So we strive to have a bit of a balance in the two buckets. And now, in order to implement all of this, of the positive discipline, I want to share with you a tool that is from Adlerian psychology. So it's part of positive parenting, and it's called the 5 R's of consequence. So this is something to be used when there's a need for consequence. There isn't always a need for consequence in discipline. Sometimes we might talk through something, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there needs to be a consequence installed straight away. This is for when it becomes challenging and there is, I'll explain, an obvious need for a consequence. For example, the elements of this is that the consequence needs to be respectful. So one, again, showing that calm, being that calm when we're trying to deal with what's happening. We're still showing respect. There's no blame, shame, or pain when we're dealing with the consequence. The consequence needs to be related. That means that if the behavior, for example, is technology, so we've agreed within the house that everything is going to be turned off at 10. Okay, so then they're not respecting our agreement that we maybe talked through and that we've agreed on together as a family. They're not respecting that. And so then that means that the consequence for that needs to be respectful, and it needs to be related to that. If they're not turning off their devices at 10 and the consequence is, for example, well, you're not going to be able to go on the school trip tomorrow, it's not directly related to them. And so it's hard for them to connect it in their mind. And especially for younger children, it needs to be very clear where the connection is from the behavior to the consequence, the choice of behavior to the consequence. So it also needs to be reasonable. Reasonable because if it doesn't need to be longer or more severe, then we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be making something very strict or longer than it needs to be. It still needs to be fair. Remember, we're trying to be fair and firm at the same time. The consequence has to be revealed in advance. That means that they have to have time to know and to agree on what the consequence is, and they have to know ahead of time what that consequence might be, if we need a consequence. And then the consequence has to be repeated back. That means that if we say, Okay, I noticed that at 10 o'clock, we're finding it hard to turn devices off and it's not happening. We've decided that the new rule is that at when there's maybe 5 minutes to, I will come and remind you, or you will set an alarm yourself to remind yourself of that. And that is our new consequence, so that they're going to set a reminder so that they know when it's almost time to turn off their devices. We want them to then repeat that back to us. It might seem a bit odd at first having them repeat that, but actually, by them repeating it and them saying it, they are more aware that it's now up to them to make that choice of behavior. And we want to remind them that we've agreed on something and it's now up to them. We've told them in advance of what the consequence might be. We've agreed on the consequence. They've set it back. And so we know now that they understand what that might be. So, how do we then do this? So, here I've got kind of like a little script, and because I'll share the recording with you, if you need to go back to this or if you just want the slides, let me know if you want to look back at some of the language. So, if we feel like the particular behavior has a consequence that is related to it, and that in that case needs a consequence, the first step is that we want to state what the problem is. For example, I noticed we've had some issues with technology or with coming back at the time which we agreed you'd be coming back home. State then what the expected behavior is. In the future, I expect that we can come to an agreement, or in the future, I expect that you will make a better choice. Step three, what is going to be the consequence? So we could say something like, I know that in the future we're not going to have this problem, or I know that this is not a problem we're always going to have. But if you choose to not respect our new rule, then we say what the consequence is that we've agreed on. Again, this is not something that we can use for any type of behavior. This is a specific tool to use when there's a challenging behavior that has a direct relevant consequence to it. And the reason why I'm using the technology one a lot is because it's the one that I hear from other workshops and from students that tends to be quite hard to find boundaries on. Four, then we ask them to repeat back. Just so we're on the same page, can you tell me what we've agreed on? What is our new rule? And what is the consequence if you still choose to make that choice? Okay, so what we're doing is we're being respectful, they have dignity, and we're not using blame, shame, or pain. That's not emotional or physical. What if? So here you have, I'm sure, a lot of thoughts. What if this doesn't happen? What if they're not repeating it back? What if they choose not to repeat it back? Then maybe if we're having a lot of resistance, a lot of rebellion, maybe then the behavior is telling us something else. Maybe it's not about turning it off. Maybe there's something else which we want to explore a bit more. Because repeating it back, what we could say is that if it's about technology, for example, repeating it back and coming to an agreement of what the new rule, the new agreement is going to be, shows that they're responsible, that we know that they're trying to be responsible with technology. So if we see that there's a lot of resistance in this, then maybe we have to think about, is the behavior what we're seeing really about that, or is there something else underneath, under the surface that we need to explore? What if they repeat it back, but they're still making a poor choice, which can happen. Again, we're human, they're human, and so that can happen as well. But if we've agreed, for example, for technology, what our boundary, what our agreement is, then we need to follow through. We need to follow through with what we've agreed on, because if we don't follow through, then we might become too permissive, and they might also not know what to expect. Like I said, routine is and structure and boundaries, they give us a sense of safety. We know what to expect. If we agree on something and then it doesn't happen, we've given another uncertainty again. So that means that if we agree on something, that needs to happen. It's kind of like promises, where we, especially with younger children, and even actually with our older students, if we're making promises, we have to be sure that we can stick to that promise, because otherwise, then they start to lose faith in us being able to follow through with things. And we want to avoid using the I told you so, I spelled that wrong there, I told you so tone or language. Another what if I can't think of a consequence for this behavior? So I'm trying to be restorative, I'm trying to be firm but kind, but I can't think of a consequence for this action that's happened. then maybe that's telling us that consequence isn't the right tool right now. We need to explore the behavior a bit more, because if you can't think of the consequence straight away, like with technology, if the consequence can't be that maybe they need to put their phone away earlier, there isn't a direct link in their mind or connection from behavior to consequence, then that's not the right tool. And we need to try to think of another tool to use. We need to explore that a bit more. So remember, these are the parenting styles. We will sometimes dip into some of these other areas. It's hard to always be high on the firm and high on the fair, and to be restorative and to work with them with the behavior and supportive. We want to try to do that every day, and we want to set goals and try to achieve that, but it's not going to happen all the time. And that's okay as well. We need to be able to be aware of ourselves and to learn and notice within ourselves, when am I being too punitive? When am I being too permissive? When am I being maybe absent? And when did something go well and we were being restorative and working together as a family? So I hope that that wasn't too much information, that you found it informative. There are other tools for positive discipline or for positive parenting, which I can share. If you want me to talk about them in a bit more depth in another workshop, let me know that. That's really helpful for me to know, and that helps me to choose the topics to work on.